Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's symposium on person-generated health data, and really the question about whether our field is really ready to incorporate these types of measures into routine pharmacoepi studies. So I think by now we're all pretty familiar with the concept of big data, the idea of looking at data that are tied to the healthcare system, how they're all linked, and they give us a picture in terms of what's happening in the healthcare setting. We then have kind of integration of these data sources. We can do various types of analyses. But the big question is now we're on the era of additional data, the Internet of Things. These things that we have that are in our cell phones, we wear them, different types of implantable devices as well. And how can we use these for routine safety assessment and give us the insights of the real world outside of the healthcare setting? When we think towards a future vision of pharmacovigilance, and this includes real-world evidence data, we can think about going beyond spontaneous reports, looking at real-world evidence data, clinical trials.
If you step closer to the mic, we can fix the feedback.
Okay. This a little better? Okay. And really kind of harmonizing then these data sources, so we're looking at side-by-side multimodal surveillance of these data sources. And what that requires, however, is really the crosswalk of the different types of coding structures between the different data sources. So we think about measure-based PTs, or adverse events from clinical trials. How does that map to data in spontaneous reports or ICD-10-based types of codes within real-world data? When we think about the overall systems where we have these side-by-side types of assessments, we can then look at multimodal surveillance for a safety assessment and really do proper benefit-risk assessment in a more efficient manner. Now, we have a problem, though, in terms of the overall ways in which these data sources are available in terms of these wearables. We have some data sources that are ubiquitous, and however, they have poor precision and accuracy. And in contrast, as we move along the x-axis here, you can see that we have other types of technologies that are very precise and accurate. However, they're not really used by a lot of different people. So we have the trade-off between generalizable types of patterns versus those that may be inherently biased. So today we have the privilege of actually having a really great set of panelists here. We have Will Dixon, who's a professor of digital epi from the University of Manchester. We have Paul Copeland, a former colleague of mine from Johnson & Johnson Medical Devices. Mary Beth Ritchie from Regulatory and also University of Rutgers. And Robert Platt from McGill University as well. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Will Dixon.
Thank you. Right, so the outline of what I'm going to cover in the next 15 minutes or so. We're going to start simple. We're going to cover what do we need to do pharmacoepidemiology, and then introduce the concept of patient or person-generated health data. I'm going to talk about the opportunities of collecting that via consumer devices like smartphones, and then I'm going to show you a couple of case studies, one that we've been working on in Manchester for the last 8 years or so, and one that we've started in the last month. So this is what we need to do in pharmacoepidemiology. You need to measure the exposure, which in our case is medication. You need to measure the outcome. If you're looking at the effectiveness of drugs, that might be a change in disease severity. If you're thinking about safety, that might be the presence or absence of a side effect. And then you have to adjust for the confounders, the things associated with the exposure and the outcome. That might be something like disease severity. And in my time doing pharmacoepidemiology, I'm sometimes somewhat frustrated that we don't always have the quality of data that we might want. And it can be a bit like looking through a picket fence of the data. We need to know who's had what drug, but actually what we know is who's been prescribed a drug or who's been dispensed a drug, but you don't know who's actually taken it, which is what you should really know. You might know about the serious side effects, whether somebody's died or whether they've had a heart attack, but what about if they've had depression or something else that really makes a difference to them, but perhaps isn't captured in their electronic health record or their admin data? But if you want to know whether a patient has taken their drugs or whether they've had a certain side effect, who do you think we should ask? Well, clearly it's the patient that you should ask, and maybe we could do that. Now that opens this idea of patient or person-generated data, asking the patient themselves, and this is defined in the following way: health-related data recorded, collected, or generated from a patient or a patient's designees outside of a clinical setting without the interaction or interference, honestly, from a clinician or member of the patient's medical team. It's a bit of a clunky terminology, isn't it, PGHD, but that seems to be what's being adopted. Now, we've been collecting personal patient-generated data for a long time, patient-reported outcomes, patient-generated health data, but the opportunities are changing. So this is how we've done it for the last 100 years, pen and paper, but we should be thinking as a society of how we move into the 21st century to collect data direct from patients and the public. Now, I'm particularly interested in how we collect that digitally and what it offers. So the first thing that it offers is that you can collect data in a novel way. You can collect traditional data like questionnaires, but mounted on a digital device. But you can collect things differently as well. So here's a picture of a smartphone. You'll recognize that. It hosts applications or apps. And here's an app in rheumatoid arthritis. I'm a rheumatologist as well as an epidemiologist. And this allows somebody to score the location and presence or absence of pain or swelling at their joints. But the smartphone's like a Swiss Army knife, that it includes a whole load of other technology as well. It includes a gyroscope, it includes accelerometers, triaxial accelerometers, and that allows the phone to understand how it's moving, and that can be converted into things like physical activity metrics. So here is step count. It can differentiate between different types of activity. In the top right-hand corner, you'll recognize the GPS icon, the Global Positioning System. That allows your phone to know where in the world it is, and that can be linked to other information, such as the weather data and your weather app that tells you it's another cloudy and miserable day in Manchester. Now, you can harness these types of data to do health research. We've used the self-reported symptom data together with data from the GPS and linked weather data to run this study called Cloudy with a Chance of Pain. It was examining the relationship between weather and pain in 13,000 people in the UK. You know, you've heard the old wives' tale. You can tell it's going to rain because you can feel it in your hip. So we address that scientifically. The second opportunity is that it can collect time series data. So when I see patients, I only see them once every 6 months or so. What happens in between those clinics? Well, I don't know. I only know because I ask them and they try and recall and remember what's happened. 9 in 10 people in the UK and in many other countries own a smartphone, so you can reach a larger number of people. That screen that we might collect data from also allows you to communicate back with patients and the public, and you can even do interventions through the screen. And then the volume of data and the types of data open up whole new study designs, so you can do within-person analyses. You do the things like N of 1 studies. AI and machine learning are obviously amenable to this rich data. So you've heard the data requirements, you know what patient-generated data is, we're thinking about collecting that from smartphones. So let me just show you a few worked examples of this. So from these 3 things to measure, we started with disease severity because that's actually the easiest of the 3 to collect directly. So I'm going to show you the first case study from a study called Remora, or Remote Monitoring of Rheumatoid Arthritis. And then the second study is measuring the side effects in a project called Sick Dog. I work, as I said, as a rheumatologist as well as an epidemiologist, and I guess I try and align these 2 areas of work so that I don't have to do quite so much, try and do it to meet both needs. This next project you'll see, Remora, is founded in my clinical practice, but also with my epidemiological hat on, thinking of how can we use that data for research. So as I've suggested already, when you see people in clinic, your opening question is, how have you been in the last 6 months? It's probably one of the hardest questions in the world to answer, and yet you've only got sort of 30 seconds, 60 seconds to tell the doctor how you've been, and yet we base all of our treatment decisions on that information. So Remora began with this idea that we could co-design a system to collect daily symptoms via a smartphone app in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, and uniquely integrate that into the electronic health record so that the clinician could see a graph of how the patient had been since they were last seen. And it was designed so that the data that we collected would support self-management, plus support clinical care, and also be reusable for research. And it's gone through various different stages. We did a proof of concept study at a single site in 2015, then built more scalable infrastructure over a few years, and we're now underway doing a multi-site step-wedge randomized trial to prove that integrated symptom tracking leads to better outcomes compared to usual care. So this is what it looks like. You've got very simple user interface, quick and easy questions on a daily basis about pain, function, fatigue, etc. And then we have more detailed questions less frequently. So weekly questions about the tender and swollen joints as an example, and then on a monthly basis, again, further longer questionnaires such as this one about disability. The infrastructure is that a patient can be recommended to do their symptom tracking. They can download the app from the App Store. We then integrate with a system called NHS Login, which is your unique NHS ID in the UK. That's proven extremely difficult to get set up, but is working. We then send the data into a regional infrastructure from where we visualize it for a patient, generating that graph of how somebody's been, and then you can have a view onto that from the electronic health record via a single sign-on so that the doctor doesn't have to log into a different system, doesn't even have to find the patient, they're already logged into that patient. And so in our first phase, patients were very positive about the app. They thought it was a great idea, a brilliant thing, couldn't wait until it's out there properly. Data collection was felt to capture the moment, make these fleeting symptoms that people experience visible to themselves and to their doctor, picked up changes that would otherwise have been missed. So that graph that you can see there, over just a 1 month period, that patient came back to clinic. We said, how have you been? They said, absolutely fine, doctor. Then we looked at the graph and saw that they'd had a spike in their pain just 2 weeks earlier when they'd been doing symptom tracking. They had access to their graphs. They were coming to an audio recorded consultation about remote monitoring, and they still didn't remember. These symptom graphs make it easier for a shared conversation. You worry that it's going to make it harder, the doctor's going to have their head in the screen, but actually it's a visual aid that helped discussion. The patients felt it personalized their care because the data said it for them. It was they generated the data themselves, and it provides evidence. I guess there's lots of concerns about doing this, though. Will people actually do it longitudinally through time? So these are people, each line is one person, each dot on the line is a day in which they've completed it, and this is our most recent cohort of people with follow-up over 6 months. So you can see that the engagement is actually really good. Around 2/3 of days over a 6-month period are completed. I mentioned that we can reuse this data not just for clinical care but also for research. So let me give you an example of that. So here I am back in the clinic. I haven't moved since last time. And I'm saying to the patient, well, given that you've had a flare in your arthritis, I'm going to give you a steroid injection. And the patient says, well, how long is that going to work for, doctor? I go, oh, right. I'll go to the published evidence about how long it works, and here it is. This is the published evidence about how long steroid injections work for. There just is no published evidence. The drugs have been on the market for 70 years, but it's a really hard question to answer because you have to have tracked people's symptoms through time, which we weren't able to do. So using data from Remora, we were able to find people who'd had steroid injections and then see what happened to them. So here's 9 steroid injections. You can see the graphs of daily symptoms. The vertical lines are days on which they had the steroids. The one in the middle right looks like what I thought how patients respond to steroid injections. The others don't necessarily look quite like that. So we were then able to kind of quantify across a population, albeit a very small one, what people's pain scores were before they had the injection, how many of them had a treatment response, the extent of the response, how long the response lasted for. So we're getting into a position where we can generate evidence that doesn't currently exist using tracked symptom data on a daily basis. Last thing from me is the start of this project called Sick Dog. It's called Sick Dog because people say, I took that tablet and it made me feel sick as a dog. So it's all about the simple language description of side effects. And we presented this as a concept at ICPE 2 years ago. And it's sort of founded on the basis that people's descriptions of their side effects are really useful. When I've seen patients in clinic, they describe how they were taking this tablet, they developed a side effect, they stopped the tablet, it went away, they tried it again, it came back, that kind of challenge, re-challenge, helps us know that it was the drug that contributed. So the stories are important, we learn about the impact of what happened, but to do epidemiology, we have to have codes, we have to be able to analyze across populations. Those stories don't really help us to do pharmacoepi. But if you ask the patients to code it, they wouldn't necessarily know how to code it. If they had a swollen ankle, is that ankle edema? Is that, have they got an episode of gout? So we have to help them do that. Now we know from work that we've done with natural language processing that we can find side effects within a wider body of text. So if they did tell us a story, we could in theory find the bit that looks like a side effect. And then maybe we can help the patient find the right code. Which means that we do it in real time and it doesn't rely on another human who's not there with the patient, who's just guessing what do they mean by ankle swelling. And then, as with all of the work that we do, we're trying to design this in such a way that we collect the data once and reuse it for multiple purposes. So if you had a record of your own side effects, wouldn't that be good? We could support clinical care. How have you been in the last 6 months? Have you had any problems with your medication? Oh yes, I've got a record of it, I tracked it. It could be used for research studies or sent through for spontaneous pharmacovigilance, designed in the same way. So that was just a concept. The picture that you see on the left was just a PowerPoint slide, but we're trying to take it from a PowerPoint slide just to a more interactive prototype, kind of a clickable prototype. It doesn't actually work yet, so everything you see is just drawings. Some of them move, but it's nothing more than that at present. But we have to work with patients to do this. So here's our first workshop with 5 patient partners. And the idea here is that we have to really get inside patients' heads to know why would they be motivated to do this, particularly if we want to collect it longitudinally. If they don't understand why they should do it or why they should be bothered to, then they just will delete it. So we have to understand what of our design works, what doesn't work, what are the barriers in using it, what are the enablers. The next screen you'll see 3 parts. The first and the third part came about because of the workshop. We've kind of built it subsequently because first of all patients said, well, you're asking us to report this side effect but we don't really know why. So we built this first screen to say, well, we're doing this because we want to track your side effects and you might use it for self-management or clinical care or research or regulators. And then we'd have a consent screen that sort of says you're going to control who you will share your data with. I'm going to show you the middle one now, which was the kind of core bit of what we wanted to do. So here you can see a screen where someone's entering the story of their side effect. So I started methotrexate 3 weeks ago. I had a variety of reductions, so we're just showing that we can get the wording wrong that we've got to deal with and correct. Spots had a temperature on Saturday, take it on a Wednesday evening, and spent much of Thursday in the bathroom with a furry herd, fuzzy head that was supposed to be. But there's 4 different side effects in that story. And now our job is to find the side effects and have the patient help us code them. So this bit's animated, so you can hopefully see what happens here. So here we're confirming that we've picked up the right side effects, and this is the right latex. We've got 3 out of 4. We're just going to go straight ahead. And now you said spots, but what's the right code for spots? Did you mean rash or boil or abscess or even spots before your eyes? So these are MEDRA terms. They're the lay descriptions of MEDRA with some extra explanation to explain what we mean by that. So temp, was that high temperature or something else? Spent much of Thursday in the bathroom. Well, that could be anything, right? Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Were you scared of something that was elsewhere in the house? Spiders, maybe. But you see that with the help, we've chosen the right thing. But otherwise, you just had no idea what that was. So we go from the rich story to the coded data, ready for pharmacoepidemiology or clinical care or other things. And then, oops, I need to do that again. And then you can see on the right-hand side, something that the patient said, well, it would be really good if we had that information for ourselves. And so we've designed it so that you've got a searchable set of the side effects that you've reported, and you can filter it by various things. So in summary, we have an opportunity for patient-generated health data to improve the data foundation for pharmacoepidemiology. I think it's a massive opportunity. We need, as a community, to engage here and to lead here, right? With this vast posters about how we deal with how do we get around the fact that we haven't got prescribed, we haven't got, who's taken what drug or what side effect they've had. Let's collect the data better. This is necessarily interdisciplinary research, so you have to go outside of your comfort zone and work with other people. And now we're going to have some further examples of work that's been done, but also some of the challenges that are to come. I just need to acknowledge everyone that's helped contribute to it, which is a big team effort, and a very brief advert for a new network that we're establishing in the UK around the use of smartphones and wearables for health research. So if that's of any interest, get in touch with me. We can put your name on the start of a mailing list that begins next year. Thank you very much.
There's lots of seats in the front, so please come up if you want to get a seat. Thanks, everyone. It's an honor to be part of this panel. And let me just get my timer going so I can make sure I'm on time. So I'm going to be talking from the perspective of working from the industry perspective, and but also industry in collaboration with FDA through this program called the National Evaluation System for Health Technology. So I'll talk further about that. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues Shumin Zhang and Guy Caffrey, who helped with some of these analyses and studies. So by way of disclosure, these are my opinions, not that of my employer, which is Johnson & Johnson. So I'll first talk about what is NEST, then look at a demonstration project with NEST that was also in collaboration with Mayo Clinic and Mercy, involving wearables, but also digital electronic health records. Then talk about a case study that was funded by NEST through the NEST program that was for cardiac ablation, and then go on to a J&J label extension that used using electronic health records that was built on the NEST test case. And then finally on some research that we've been doing on using digital navigation data linked to patient EHR data to predict surgical success and improve the outcomes of surgery. So what is NEST? Well, the way I look at it is kind of like the sentinel of medical devices. So FDA has three groups, devices or drugs, biologics and devices. And Sentinel does a lot of the public-private partnership work on evidence for drugs and biologics. And the director of CDRH, the FDA's device division, Jeff Shuren, and some of the leadership at FDA CDRH created this initiative to foster the use of real-world evidence. And they built it as a public-private partnership. Rather, Sentinel tends to be a little bit separate from industry partners, whereas NEST is really is a collaborative initiative. It involves a evidence generation component, as well as building a collaborative community for figuring out how to do this type of work accurately and well. So NEST has also built two research work frameworks and work streams to develop these frameworks. One is a research methods framework group, and the other one is a data quality framework group. And they're designed to help define and develop not like white papers on how to do methods well for medical devices and how to do and what are the criteria for data quality. I should add that there's been a lot of interest in many countries outside of the US, including Japan and China, about how to build similar kind of initiatives to NEST that fit the environment in those countries. And so we've seen some initiatives that are NEST-like in other parts of the world occurring. So the demonstration project was a project that was funded by through this CERSI program, which is an FDA funding of Mayo Clinic and Yale New Haven Hospital, and then J&J provided funding for this digital app. And Harlan Krumholtz, who's a leading cardiology professor and academic at Yale, noted that there was just a lot of work that went into doing big randomized controlled clinical trials for cardiovascular drugs and questions. And then they'd build this infrastructure. It cost $500 million or $300 million or something to build that infrastructure, and then they'd collapse at the end of the study, they'd collapse it down, and then next time there'd be a new study to have to be built up. And also that a lot of the data that was being used were in electronic health record databases is aggregated at the provider level, and they make a lot of money out of it, but the patient's data is, the patient's not getting any money out of that, and the patient doesn't get an aggregated health record. So if someone goes from Mayo Clinic to moves to California and now starts at Kaiser, that information is lost in that electronic health record. So could you build a longitudinal patient electronic health record that the patient owns, so they can give informed consent if they want it to be used for research? If they do, they can charge a price for it. But not only that, the patient now gets a longitudinal health record where they can track their information across over the past 20, 30 years, like you can do in a Scandinavian country, for example. So this app was kind of built with that in mind, and we did a study to test out whether the app could be useful in the context of clinical research. So we looked at two types of surgical procedure patients. One is people who were getting a gastric bypass surgery or sleeve gastrectomy for obesity. And another is patients who have atrial fibrillation. If you have atrial fibrillation, you can take drugs for the rest of your life, or there is a procedure and that's shown in this graphic here, where catheters pass through the inguinal vein into the left atrium, then into the right atrium, and then the pulmonary vein, which is the source of where the aberrant signal in the atrium occurs, is kind of isolated from causing an electrical signal that causes the arrhythmia in the heart. And so we looked at 60 patients, and using patients were asked to wear wearables, and then the app collected the information from the wearables and sent it back. And once it was in the app, then the app kind of spoke back to the research center, so we could basically get the information on the wearables from the patients. We had about 82% participation rate in using the wearables, and then using and getting them back into the app to get loaded up. And this shows the data for bariatric surgery patients. We can see that the number of daily steps initially went down after the surgery, but then trended upwards. And then also the weight loss clearly trended down after bariatric surgery. For the patients who got cardiac ablation, there is an initial drop in the number of steps after the procedure, but then they went up, and likewise for daily numbers, their heart rate went down after ablation. So that's one aspect of the app, which is capturing these wearables. But the other app component was this aggregation of the patient electronic health records. So one of the things we wanted to see is, could you actually get accurate information from the aggregated health records? And how does that compare with the type of information that you'd have in the electronic health records for Yale and Mayo Clinic? So this is an example of a patient who we looked at, had a clinical event, and we could track what was the information obtained in the electronic medical record at Yale in the top table, and in the bottom table is the information that was aggregated from the app that was drawing the information from the hospital's electronic health records. So when we looked at the concordance of the information in the electronic health records and the digital app across Mayo Clinic and Yale, in the 60 patients, there were 221 health encounters in the electronic health records, and the concordance was 97% for the encounter date, 92% for the type of encounter, and 92% for the primary diagnosis, suggesting that the accuracy using this aggregated information at a patient level is quite accurate. And I think there's tremendous promise for how we use this for improving longitudinal follow-up of patients in registries, clinical trials, but also in improving the practice of medicine, because now you have a patient can go back 10 years and identify what was that drug that they took, what implant did I get, which they would have forgotten otherwise and wouldn't have been available at the time when the physician's doing the intake for that patient. So that was a demonstration project, and then we went on to the next step, which was Nest announced a number of test cases, and they would provide funding for these test cases. They funded 21 test cases. They were all kind of reviewed in a blinded fashion by independent review panel. We at J&J put in 4 test cases, and 4 got funded out of 21, but it was completely blinded, so we had no preference. And we put in 2 that were about label expansion and 2 that were about post-marketing surveillance, safety surveillance. And I'll talk a little bit about the one in red, which is cardiac ablation, so I'll follow up on the theme of that. So the picture over here shows the 2 different catheters. And you can see that the improvement in the technology was to go from 6 holes to 56 holes. That allows better cooling of the tip, which is important for preventing charring, which can, charring of tissue, if it gets overheated, can cause stroke. And also because you're burning inside the heart. And it allows the clinician to not worry too much about overheating, so they can make sure that they get a good ablation that really cuts off the signal that's causing the arrhythmia. And atrial fibrillation has about a 5-fold risk factor for stroke, so it's important to treat. So what we did was we submitted this proposal. It was matched by Nest with their test partners, which were Mercy, Yale, and Mayo Clinic, and they happened to use this device. Of course, if they didn't use this device, we couldn't study it in their electronic health records. And our objective was to get a label expansion for the catheter to. It was approved to treat paroxysmal AFib, but we wanted to get a label extension for persistent AFib, which is a more chronic stage of the disease and a little bit harder to treat. So our goal was to compare the 6-hole catheter to the 56-hole catheter. The 56-hole catheter is currently approved by FDA. The 6-hole isn't, and we were looking at whether there was non-inferiority of the safety and effectiveness outcomes using the electronic health records of Mayo Clinic and Mercy Health. Mercy is a healthcare center based in St. Louis, Missouri, in 4 states, has about 40 hospitals and covers about over 4 million people. So the safety endpoint was a composite of 14 endpoints. That's because there wasn't enough power to look at any individual one alone, so it was a composite. And we used propensity score balancing. It was a distributed, federated model, so Mayo did work with their data and Mercy did work with their data. And we did propensity score balancing within each healthcare center, and then came up with a risk difference. The method for calculating the risk difference was presented in a poster this morning. We looked at 5 different methods for how to calculate the risk difference and the confidence intervals for that, and found the best one. And then took a weighted average, so almost like a meta-analysis of the data across the 2 centers, and found that it met the non-inferiority margin. And we submitted this to FDA, and it resulted in a label expansion using comparative EHR data. So then the next step was, could we take this data and use it for another label extension? So one of the things in this cardiac ablation procedure, why it's feasible, is it's just incredible advances in the technology around navigation. So I use the analogy of if you're driving these days, you almost invariably use Google Maps or Apple Maps or Waze or whichever one to help you get to your destination much better. It's great navigation. So similar surgical tools are being developed to help physicians identify where the lesion is occurring and how to map it. And this combines ultrasound, fluoroscopy, CT scans, and electrocardiograms. So typically, in the old days, we used fluoroscopy, which is X-ray. But of course, that exposes a patient to a lot of X-ray. And also the surgeon has to wear a heavy lead coat to avoid getting that X-ray. So we did an analysis to see if we could demonstrate that when physicians were using ultrasound rather than X-ray, did we get equivalent outcomes for patients with and without X-ray? So we looked at we used two databases. One was a registry data where we compared against a performance goal, but the other one was using the Mercy electronic health record, and we compared those who got a low fluoroscopy and those patients who were treated with high fluoroscopy, and looked at the outcomes, and they were equivalent, and that was the basis for FDA accepting a label change for 8 devices to say it's not mandatory to use X-ray. You can use X-ray or ultrasound to conduct this procedure. So the other aspect that we've been looking at is that digital data is a huge source of information of what's occurring during the procedure. So can we use that to predict a successful surgery for patients? So it turns out that about the cardiac ablation procedure is about 78% effective. But there's 22% of patients who that surgery won't be effective because the ablation didn't really stop the aberrant signal. So if we can use machine learning and large data to try and predict where to put that to get a better quality of the ablation, that can improve the outcomes for patients. So we worked with Mercy, and there's the navigation data stored in this system called Cardo, gets uploaded into the cloud using Microsoft Azure, and we had to run some machine learning models on the data because it's about 10 terabytes of data for every patient. So we ran some machine learning models to kind of pick up some structured variables within that, and then used that. Once we had the structured variables, looked at whether those structured variables on the type of procedure that was being done and how much energy was being used, how long the ablation, in which parts of the atrium the ablation was done, could that be used to predict the successful surgery? So where the long-term goal is to develop a kind of guidance for the surgeon as they're doing the ablation to say, this procedure, as you've done it, looks like this patient's at a 30% risk of failure. You may want to add this and this that will reduce your predicted probability down to 20% or 18%. So this is this was a poster presented yesterday where we looked at, we used an auto ML machine learning model, which is an ensemble model that looked at a number of different machine learning models and then aggregated them to come up with an average prediction model. And we did that with the clinical variables and without the clinical with clinical variables only that you could get from the EHR, and then also with the digital data that was obtained during the surgery and linked to the patient EHR. So the EHR was telling us the revision rates, the surgical data was telling us the procedure date. We linked them, then ran a machine learning model and found that once we put in the variables from the digital data, from the surgery data, that improved the prediction from 66% to 78%. So in conclusion, I think firstly wanted to really thank FDA's NEST program for fostering some of this kind of primary foundational research, basic research that was necessary to advance the field, and would encourage others to look into doing that in other environments, because I think there's a lot of these things that have to get sorted out. It's very difficult for one partner to do it alone, but if we come together and form public-private partnerships to develop the field as a whole, I think that's the way we'll really stimulate the advance. And I think, well, you showed some really cool stuff. Can we form a public-private partnership to really advance that and bring the benefit to patients? and the real world evidence is enormously informative, and we can use this type of information for label extensions in the absence of other sources of information. Our hope is that this is just the start. We're opening a pathway, and we're hoping that that you in the audience and people who are starting their career will carry this forth and advance this approach. Thank you. Mary Beth?
So here we are, it's 5 o'clock, it's day 2 of our 5 days. So it's day 2 plus the 2 pre-conference days, 5 p.m. We've been here since 8 o'clock. We've just heard from Paul all of the amazing ways that when you start adding in digital health data to an EHR and patient-generated data to an EHR, you can have very complex studies that are really, really meaningful. And we've just heard from Will that when we start pulling in more patient-generated health data, that we can have both better research and better clinical information and really have a better conversation with patients. And now you're stuck with me to talk about regulations. Well, this is very fitting. So everybody has a 15-minute nap. Perfect. I'm very uniquely biased to provide this information. We have 3 sectors in ISPE, and I have worked in all 3 sectors in the past year. And I love talking about regulations. So please, by all means, I will not be offended if people snore. I am also really cognizant that after all of this wonderful information we've just heard, that I am about to provide what is the equivalent of the United States and New Zealand. Here's a wonderful new drug, and then it does all of these wonderful things, and you see it on television, and then there's that person at the end, and here are all the problems that you have with that. So here we go. Here are all the problems that you have when you're trying to generate patient-generated health data and put them into your studies. Patient-generated health data can include information from histories and treatments and biometric data. We can include symptoms and lifestyle choices. Today, available for patients, we have PGHD that will aid with blood glucose monitoring that we all are wearing with us to capture exercise information. And we can gather information from mobile apps as well. It's really, really helpful. And these digital health technologies are using computing platforms that we already have with us. They help us with connectivity, with software, sensors, and the like. And we use them in lots of different ways. They can be used to track or monitor things that are going on. They can be used to help view the data and have a conversation about it. They can help us to sync up to platforms and walk through all of the internet connectedness of a device and add that back onto the EHR like Paul was just talking about. And they can help us to diagnose or treat a disease. And that's wonderful. We can use them within a study. And actually there's 3 different ways that patient-generated health data is used today in a study. One, we can take information that already exists and we can pull off the shelf and have this brand new data collection that's just slid in already there together. We can have a within study set of digital data that is bespoke for that study or that has a heavy modification for something that is available. Or we can use digital data that's already validated in a paper system and pull it over to an electronic system. And we do each of these in various ways. Many times these days, we also want to be able to use these pieces of information outside of a study. And when we do that, we usually need to talk to a regulator. But we may have to talk to several different types of regulators. I'm going to use the United States context because every context is a little different. This is the one I know the most about. No matter what you do, if you have an app, you're going to have to deal with the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. They deal with consumer products in general. And here, you're going to need to show that this particular product that you're using isn't trying to nefariously collect information, that you're being upfront with what you're collecting. In addition, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act is a patient privacy law in the United States. And so any data that is collected for healthcare, so it's going to the health plan, to the healthcare provider, or to some sort of healthcare clearinghouse, those data have special protections to them. Specifically, if an individual is putting data in an app, it is not part of HIPAA, unless the entity that is using that app or developed that app is part of the health plan, is the healthcare provider, or is part of the healthcare clearinghouse. And so it's a very fine line as to how that entity is set up as to whether HIPAA is going to apply when that data gets collected. In addition, if there is any indication that this might be a device, that is, that it's used to diagnose a disease or to cure a disease or to mitigate a disease or prevent a disease, or somehow measure and do an interpretation, you're going to want to talk to a regulator there as well. But FDA makes that even harder, because FDA has said, oh, if it's a low-risk device, then we're going to exercise our ability to just not worry about it. And so these low-risk apps that are helping patients themselves to self-manage their disease, FDA is saying, you don't need to come and talk to us. This is an example of one of those. It's called Storylines. It helps individuals to be able to gather their symptomology data in one place. And they can use this information to collect it themselves, and it even has a little sparkline kind of on the end to show them the tracking over time. And this type of thing is a low-risk device. It automates some simple tasks, but this is something that the FDA is saying that they're not going to enforce their device requirements for it. Nonetheless, FDA is saying that if there's some sort of display screen or sensor or some sort of attachment to a product that then helps with some portion of healthcare, then you need to go talk to them, because they're going to want to regulate that. And also, if it is a product that is specifically curating that data beyond that line, then they're going to regulate that as well. And so here, a lot of software as a medical device very quickly turns toward a need for regulation. And kind of the dividing line that I see on that one, me personally, is very much if you see a spark line, you're good to go. If you do anything other than that spark line, it's probably a device. And so for this one, the N1 headache, also collecting symptomology day by day, it does a few different pieces of curation. One, it groups information together by symptom, and that's the far left panel. Two, on the right-hand score, it takes the symptomology and pulls it into a disability score on the right-hand side. And three, in the middle, it takes all of that information and curates it to say, oh, it looks like this might be a trigger for your migraines. And while none of this is over the top necessarily, it is a prescribed device. And this is something that this particular manufacturer did indeed need to get device clearance for it. So we have those devices that need regulatory authorization. And in addition, even those that are used within a study, where these would not necessarily need to undergo any sort of review by FDA, if they're used outside of that at all, then there's some difficulties. Even if they're only used in a study, then they become part of the design features of that study. And so you may still need to talk to FDA, but there you're going to talk to them more around the concept of a patient-generated health data. We do kind of have a general framework for how we anecdotally would interact with a regulator when we're talking about patient-reported outcomes. You go and you put together your briefing document, and you wait a few months until you get to talk to them, and then you wait a few months until they tell you what we're going to say out of that meeting. Can you tell that I just left regulator? And then you hear back from them, you negotiate, and eventually you get the yes, indeed, this is the PRO you can use, and then conduct a study. And there's a lot of regulation going on in this space. Just in the past couple of years, FDA has put out 4 guidances around considerations of patient-generated health data for use just in studies. And so the first one of those talked about your data need to show that your patients are experiencing what you think and that they're representative of the group of patients that are in that population. That you need to show that you are finding what is most important to patients and that that's what you're reporting on. You need to show that you are selecting, modifying, developing, and validating your measure. And most recently in April this year, they said that you need to really think through the technologies, methods, and standards for collecting and analyzing your data. So this is primarily the drug center at the FDA. In addition, when you are going to utilize patient-generated health data that is in an electronic format, these days, especially if you're moving toward an app, you also need to think about the very vast amount of guidance that's coming out for digital health technologies. This is a selection of the digital health technology guidances that have come out in the past couple of years. All of them are done with the Center for Digital Health Excellence in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, often working together with the Drug Center at FDA. And so they are fast and furious with the guidances. So wanted to let you know that learning more about human factors and the interfaces between the person who is filling out the information and the technology itself is a big deal and lots of fun. Once you get all of this together and you have moved through this pace, there's actually a huge boon on the end of this. This is a great space. AstraZeneca just came out with a new report in Nature Medicine. And they were talking about in their oncology, respiratory, and cardiovascular trials of the past few years, they noted that right now, more than 50% of the measures in those studies could be collected using a digital health technology. And if we spent a bit more time doing development and validation, then over 75% of measures could be done in this way. And in their analysis, they found that if all of this were done, then the current amount of clinic visits that were in a clinical trial could decrease by 40%. So if we figure out how to do this, and there is now a pathway to do this with regulators, then it decreases the amount of effort that a patient has to go through in order to be part of a study. It increases the amount of information that a clinician has to work with a patient. And so there's a lot that can be done to increase our quality of data, to increase access to care, to reduce inefficiencies, and to really improve healthcare. And with that, Robert's going to tell us about how we can analyze this data once we get it.
Oops, I need my props here, sorry. So I'm not gonna tell you how to analyze the data. I'm going to raise a bunch of questions that I think we all, and particularly the methodologists among us, need to think about when we're thinking about these data. So the relevant disclosure on this page is that some of this work is done based on some consultations with Biogen, who have a strong interest in neurological drugs for diseases like multiple sclerosis, which are natural candidates for monitoring with technologies like we're talking about today. This is also work that is part of an upcoming textbook on statistical methods for real-world evidence that I'm working on with Thomas Dubray and Long Nguyen. That should be ready, supposed to be ready 6 months ago. That's how textbook writing goes. Okay, we've heard a lot about the kinds of data we can think about that we're getting from devices and from personal or digital health data. And then I'm going to dive into some of the methodological considerations that we need to think about when we're talking about these data, and some of the things that would keep a statistician up at night when he or she is thinking about working with these data. These are, and I'll go over these in some detail, high dimensional, the dimensionality of the data, the potential for training effects, the frequency of measurement, which is part of the dimensionality, composite outcomes, which is again, I mean, it really, all of these first 3 or 4 boil down to the dimensionality of the data, so I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on that, and adherence, which we have to worry about everywhere. So in our thinking, it's helpful to divide these kinds of technologies into active data collection and passive data collection. We saw a number of examples already of active data collection. That's your smartphone app is the sort of natural one. I'm looking at, say, MyFitnessPal to record what I ate for breakfast. You can think of this as sort of digitization of traditional data collection. Instead of, Will had a picture of writing on paper, instead of writing my diet down on a food frequency questionnaire, I'm recording it in my phone. It can also be thought of as an enhancement of the traditional test. In diseases like Parkinson's, for example, you might pick up, while the person is filling in their questionnaire on their phone, you might pick up a tremor because, like Will said, there's a gyroscope in here, there's a lot of other sensors that are measuring things in there. So you can think of this as just digitizing regular data collection, and like Mary Beth said, that makes it simpler for the subject to collect the data. And you can think of it as enhancement that adds complexity and interest to the data. I'm going to talk mostly about passive data collection because that's where the statistical issues really come in. Most of the statistical issues that with active data are things that we already think about a lot. We'll mention time series data. We have dimensionality issues we have to think about here. But we know how to do them. And for passive data, we know how to manage it too. It's a matter more of the scale now that we're talking about. So I hope this is going to show up. Yes, passive data. There we go. So from a smartwatch or a device, and I can't help but notice that Will is wearing an old-fashioned watch with like hands, and I'm wearing a mega smartwatch that collects about 1 million things about me every few seconds, including, for example, my number of steps, my heart rate variability, my respiration rate, something called a body battery, which mine is at 5 on a scale of 1 to 100. May have something to do with the rest of the meeting. And lots of other things that are going on in the background of the watch here. So why is that useful? Why is that important? And why does that give an analyst a headache? Well, the big problem with it is this is very high dimensional data. This is my step count from last Saturday. And I think in most of the talks we heard, this is 21,000 steps. So that's one number, right? But I'm going to use this pointer here for a second. But there's a run, a few thousand steps for a run. Then I walked, and actually, sorry, I woke up here. Then I went for a run. Then I walked my dog, and that got me to about here. Then I don't know where I was walking there. Then I took off my watch to take a shower. And then I was immobile for a while. Then I went for another walk with my dog, and then I think I went, more or less went to bed. The issue is how many data points did I just talk about in that sentence? It's several. We know that total physical activity is important. We know that sedentary behavior is important. We know that the intensity of the physical activity is important. That was a long, slow run. There were no intervals or anything like that in there, but the watch was recording that all the time. We know that adherence is important. I took off my watch right there in the middle of the session. This is one day, one person. That's a lot of data points. Imagine that for me over several days, and then imagine that averaged over hundreds or thousands of people wearing the same watch. Imagine then linking that data can be time-stamped and linked to the dietary data that I have on my phone as well. That can be linked to other things in my phone, etc. The point is that's very high-dimensional data, and we can maybe talk about this, but I suspect that much of that data is just noise. It's stuff that we're never going to be able to find things from. We need to think about what are the key features that drive health when we're talking about these data. So this becomes, potentially either a supervised or unsupervised machine learning problem, taking very high dimensional data, trying to sort it into features that are relevant to the epidemiologic problem we're trying to solve here. Again, that's a solvable problem, but we need the data and the tools and the variability within the data to work with that. There's also issues of generalizability from samples to populations. Dharmendra had a nice slide at the beginning that, the best recording tools are relatively low uptake in the general population. So we may get differential recording, and we may not see sort of average patterns of behavior among patients with a specific disease if we only look at people who are wearing watches. So this is important. I mean, I could say this in every talk I give about any subject. This is a problem that we need to consider at the design stage of our epi problems. We need to take the work that people like we've heard about Will and Paul talking about, think about how do we incorporate that into a statistical model at the design stage of a study, whether we do, like I said, an unsupervised machine learning problem or something else to say, okay, here are the key features that we think are important for this study. We'll shrink this really complicated data set down into the 3 or 4 key things that matter, and then we'll use those in a run-of-the-mill data analysis. That's all straightforward steps that we know how to do, but we need to go through those steps, I think, to get there. I want to talk briefly about practice effects or repeat effects. Repeat testing with the same instrument is going to lead to familiarity. People will develop strategies to do it to work with their phone better. Let's hypothetically say we're working on something that involves a tremor. People will learn how to make the phone work better. They'll memorize patterns, potentially. Their anxiety in doing the tests will go down as they do more of them, which might lead, or the anxiety could get worse over time, which could lead to impaired performance trends, even if nothing is there, even if performance on the test is not changing. So this requires us to think in advance about what we think those trends would be and to model those trends into our analyses, not just take apparent improvements at face value. So measurement frequency is an obvious one, I think, too. Mary Beth mentioned this too. We can reduce the number of measurements that we take on people if we can do many of them passively. But when we're talking about actively asking people to participate, we need to think about the measurement burden. We need to think about the disease course. Multiple sclerosis, for example, is a disease that waxes and wanes over time. While the trend is generally towards worse motor problems, there are waves where it gets better and worse. We need to take those into account when we're thinking about how frequently we're measuring on people. We need to think about seasonality. We need to think about daily variability. I showed you my day. I go for my run in the morning and I'm sedentary in the afternoon. We need to think about how those potential patterns affect things. And then sample size and power. This is giving us lots of data, which statisticians like, but like anyone who takes Stats 101 knows, 1 million measurements on me is not the same as 1 measurement on 1 million people. We need to think about getting these measurements on lots of people in order to be able to do things with them. I will talk briefly about composite outcomes. Here we're thinking about, and this is a quote from a chapter in this book I refer to, a function that inputs features and outputs a single value. The underlying statistical question then is kind of what I've been alluding to. How do we take the features, the raw data from the devices, and combine them in a way that allows us to produce a composite outcome that actually measures the thing we're trying to measure, whether it's motor performance or fatigue or other things. And there's obvious ways we can do that. We can ask experts, we can ask clinicians, we can model them. Ideally, I think we're going to do a combination of both to get those. This is like any composite outcome problem that statisticians and methodologists handle all the time. It's just on a much, much, much higher scale. This is another slide that a statistician could give in any talk where humans are involved, and it would almost certainly be applicable. Adherence and missing data. But this is an important problem. I showed how I took my watch off, and I could take it off right now and put it down on the table, and it would be thinking I'm sedentary for the moment. We need to think about how to measure and quantify and then incorporate into our data analyses potential variability in adherence by person, by time of day, by state of disease, so on. And the reasons for adherence and the reasons for missing data are likely informative. That is, it's probably not random that some people wear their watches every day and some leave them some days and wear them other days. It's some people record their diet religiously on here, some don't. This is an open area for research, and there are a lot of open questions for statisticians and methodologists to think about here. So I will wrap up just by saying, obviously we've seen a series of talks today that show that there is huge, huge potential here. We're potentially able to capture signals that would just be impossible with our old-fashioned data collection methods. There's signals that we can then link from smartwatch data to administrative claims data or AHR data. Again, huge potential there. That being said, that gives us a huge challenge from the methodological perspective of what to do with all these data and how to manage them. And I'll end just by saying these are not new problems. They're issues that we know how to handle. We just don't know how to handle them, or we have to work to handle them at the scope that we're dealing with today. So I'll end there, and I think we have time for questions at the end. I realize we are now standing between you and the social event, so feel free if you want to.
Well, thank you, panelists, for the great talks. The mic is open. Any questions? Please approach the mic. State your name, affiliation, and question. I'll start with one. So, generative AI and this topic right here in terms of the potential to advance how we move into the space. Any thoughts in terms of the challenges and opportunities with AI in general at ML?
Well, I think one clear opportunity for epidemiologists is we have to validate our outcomes, and often that involves chart review, and we were just, Harriet's nodding her head because we discussed this at the digital SIG yesterday. So if you have to review a patient's chart with like 200 pages, that can take a physician a lot of time, but that's something that could be aggregated by a tool like ChatGPT to bring out the most relevant information. So it's playing its role of aggregating important data, but then the judgment is still being made by the clinician doing the chart review. So just facilitating the time.
And I think it has real potential. The foundational models just mean that we can deal with different types of data much better than we could before. So the PhD that I mentioned that was looking at finding side effects, the technology's moved on so much since then that we're going to be able to find with much greater accuracy what somebody, we're going to find that side effect information because it's been trained on an enormous body of data. So it's good for us and the accuracy of that project, and we'll be able to get it validated better.
And I think in the kinds of things I was talking about it is the solution. What we need to do is get to the data sets that can actually do it. We need the EHRs and the claims and, you know, millions of people's worth of smartwatch data linked together and things like that to be able to manage it, because it's a tremendously high dimensional problem, basically.
I mean, it's really taking what Will was talking about for the Sick Dog app and translating that from all of the generative AI to be able to categorize. And I think that would be huge for us. I think it's going to take a lot of supervised learning and then unsupervised learning to get there. But I think that scalability and making that happen and moving in that direction is something we all need to be doing.
Thank you. Question?
Sure. Well, thank you to the panel for a great presentation and for, I guess, showing a great overview of the potential opportunities for patient-generated data. I am Wendy Camelo Castillo, University of Maryland. And my question has to do with some of the issues that Robert highlighted in his presentation regarding the importance of increasing sample size. And so far, some of the examples are focused on very specific populations where you can sort of control the type of device that you're using to capture the measurements. But if we really want to obtain population-based measurements, the challenge is how do you deal with having a very specific device or a device that has been FDA approved versus using potentially consumer-based devices or products that could give you a wider range of measurements, but that may not be compatible or not measure the same thing as devices that have been approved by the FDA. So I just wanted to get sort of like the opinion or a comment from the panelists in regards to the opportunity for using consumer-based products to be able to inform, for example, safety signals when we are trying to compare that to what is used in clinical trials. For example, ActiWatch versus Fitbit or any other wearable tracker.
I think the standardization of the metrics is clearly a difficult problem. The companies that create those metrics, it's their core business to keep that secret as to how they go from the raw accelerometer data to their measure of a step count. And there have been plenty of studies that have put individuals on a treadmill that said walk this distance, and they've loaded their arm up with a whole load of different devices, and they give slightly different results. You know, they're getting closer than they used to be, but they're still different. I mean, I think one of the real opportunities from having time series data within an individual is that you can be interested in change within a person. So even if these things aren't measuring things identically, so you've got a Fitbit device that said you did 9,500 steps and something else that said you did 10,500 steps, your change through time is going to be measured in a pretty similar way. So we just have to think as to how we get around these problems, but I think because you're measuring things longitudinally, there are definitely opportunities to do that.
I think there's a lot of different pieces in the question you've asked as well. So we're seeing, or at least my personal experience is that we're seeing devices that are approved or cleared may or may not be the right tool to measure an endpoint in a clinical trial. And we see that whether or not it's digital health involved. The endpoints in pre-market studies may not be what patients are really wanting, what patients are really needing in the real world. And so I think that we feel that a lot more because the two centers don't necessarily align there. And then when you add on top of that kind of consideration of a trial versus real world, then we have the issue of standardization. The Patient Engagement Advisory Council for CDRH has noted multiple times that standardization is desperately needed in this realm. And since you're asking questions about it, I'm just going to be sure that you get added to the list of people who really wants to be involved in this.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks very much to the panel and Dharmendra. I'm Courtney Davis. I lead the epidemiology team at Janssen Pharma J&J. I have a question for Will. Will, really intrigued by your presentation, especially the use case you showed about the steroid injections, how long they last, being able to immediately pull up trajectories and look at them and summarize them. I'm just wondering, are you also looking at benefits and risks when you're talking to the patients? Are you able to kind of summarize both and also potentially using those same data to predict how long a response might be? Thanks.
In theory, what we should be doing when we suggest a medication for a patient is counsel them so that they make an informed decision about the benefits and the harms of the treatment. That's in the international guidelines for steroids. It says you should start by telling the patient how much better are they going to get and what are the chances of a side effect. How much better are they going to get? We've just shown you that there is no information about the extent or duration of steroid use, so we just do our best and hopefully we'll be creating more evidence around that. There are a whole range of different side effects as well. There are whole conferences given over to glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis and fractures, and so we know an awful lot about that, even accounting for time-varying prednisolone exposure. We did an analysis of patients' discussions of prednisolone using Twitter. So we took several years of Twitter data where people were talking about steroids, and then we looked for the side effects. As we mentioned in SickDog, that you can do that, you can find the side effects. And the thing that patients spoke about most frequently was weight gain and insomnia. And you think, well, of course, we already knew that those were established side effects. But again, if you go to the literature and say, what is the effect size with weight gain? How much will you put on with this dose? Nothing. How long will people's weight take to come off again once they stop the steroids? No idea. What about insomnia? We don't know, because it's hard to measure. You have to measure what dose people are taking through time, how their sleep patterns are changing. It's not in their health records. So the long-term vision is that through mobile health research, we can fill these gaps. We can fill the gap of how much better is it and some of the harms that we haven't previously been able to quantify. So we know that we should be doing it. Doctors just bluff. They say, well, the side effects are not as bad as they would be if you were taking a higher dose. And the patient goes, oh, thank you very much, doctor. Hang on, you didn't answer my question. But that's kind of what we have to do because we haven't got the evidence.
Thank you.
So I'd also echo thanks to the panel for a great series of presentations. I'm Jeff Curtis at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I wanted to revisit one of the problems that, Robert, you nicely touched on about adherence. And I guess, Will, I was encouraged and dismayed by the 62% adherence of the person days that you had data, so you were missing them for 38%. So I would invite any of you to comment. How do we make this kind of data useful to patients? And in your SickDog app, Will, you called out, you could help research, you could help support the quantified self, you could help regulators, you could maybe help your doctor. I suspect some of those appeals may fall on deaf ears, and patients could care less about helping regulators, for example. But I guess, is there a way to know which approach, which appeal might be most effective for patients to be part of a research study or keep doing it? And how do we make this data useful to patients so they'll keep providing it and provide meaning? And I'd invite you, Will, or any of the panel members to comment on that. Yeah, so let me start. I mean, I think you have to do qualitative as well as quantitative research in this area. So, SickDog, you saw the first picture was of a workshop that we did with patients to understand their perspectives. So you have to talk to people and get inside their heads and what might motivate them. Now, the same motivator is not going to be the same across the population, so you have to build it to suit multiple people and their viewpoints. The kind of the extent of the completeness, the adherence to the symptom tracking, it's not going to be perfect. You saw the top line, the first person who came into the study entered data almost every day. Then there's other people who are tourists, they enter data for a day and then they disappear. And you think, well, it's only 62% on average. But you have to remember that before we did the symptom tracking, what we had was 0. And so learning something about what happens to people between their clinic visits
is often still useful. We don't know how often you have to track data for it to still be useful. You know, we're doing it daily. We kind of thought that that might be too often. In our first patient engagement, they said, well, we'll just tell you when we're having a flare. And we said, well, actually, the research part of it requires us to know more frequently, and would you mind if we did it? Oh, well, now that you've told us that you need it for that reason, we're happy to do it. But if we took away 6 of those 7 days, would we lose valuable information? We don't yet know, but we'll be able to study that once we do get the daily data from a lot of people and then kind of artificially remove those data points.
Yeah, I think that I was just going to add that's a relatively solvable modeling problem if we have the data, but we need to collect it and then collect enough complete people and then enough incomplete people to figure out the best ways to model it.
And from a regulatory perspective, is there perhaps a different standard for missingness? I mean, is 38% missing of patient data in a trial, you know, are you going to look askance at that? Do you feel like regulators might be unhappy with that, or might that be sufficient to be acceptable, do you think?
I can start, but I will provide my personal, thoughts on this. I can't speak on behalf of any regulator. It's very dependent on what that data is being used for. If you need all of the data from a patient in order to generate your endpoint for that patient, then you need all of that data in order to have your trial be successful. But in this realm of patient-generated health data, because it is such rich data and there's so many data points being collected, we generally don't need all of the information. Like, we need to know how many minutes Robert was sitting still through his day. We don't necessarily need to know exactly what time it was, unless we're doing a study about 3 to 4 p.m. And then we need to know that particular time frame. And so it's very, very dependent on the study, and that translation of the patient-generated health data that is collected in the real world to whatever that more stringent study is a very difficult and nuanced sort of thing.
Another way of saying that is it your primary endpoint or a secondary endpoint or exploratory endpoint? So probably if it's exploratory or secondary, it could provide supportive data, but wouldn't have the same. Probably if you had 38% missing for your primary data, primary endpoint, it wouldn't be acceptable.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any further questions? All right.
Hi, my name is Henry from McGill. Sorry, it may sound like a very naive question, but I want to know if the machine learning models that are being produced from all of this data, do they need to also go through some form of regulation, or are they seen as like devices on themselves apart from the foundational machine or software or mobile device that they are layered under? I don't know whether
It depends on what you're doing with it. A lot of medical devices these days are actually software as a medical device, where it is an AI-generated algorithm that is doing something. And because it is doing something that is diagnosing, mitigating, treating a disease, it then becomes a medical device. They are fascinating. And a lot of imaging data, a lot of clinical notes, the algorithms that are being applied, that does then indeed become a medical device, and those do need to go to the regulators for review.
Okay, so but what of those that are being used just to like sort of provide some clinical decision support that are not really part of the device?
Yeah, we had a situation where our team developed an AI-based model that could, for in the area of ophthalmics and to pick up ophthalmic disease that needed treatment, that typically gets treated late, and so developing an AI-based prediction model so that it would help with the diagnosis and early treatment. And we took it to FDA, and were really surprised at how the FDA really, firstly, it was SAMD, so it has to, software as a medical device, so it had to go through regulatory, but it required a clinical study to validate the model. So that's just an N of one, but based on that, I suspect that AI-based models are going to be very difficult to get approved by FDA because there's so much concern about AI being a rather dark force and perhaps playing havoc with humanity. So I think that's going to translate into high regulatory sense, but that's an N of one.
If we need another N of one in the other direction, the FDA put out a selection of 90 examples in 2021 that use real-world evidence, and there were several of them that were specific to software as a medical device, where they were using only real-world data in order to show the validation of the algorithm and put forward the information to get the device cleared. So,
But
it
that
could go
was up to 2019, and was it AI-based model?
It was.
It included AI-based models?
Yes. It's a very interesting and nuanced area. Happy to chat more about it, but I'm noticing the time and I don't want
The short answer is that the question is not a naive one at all. It's a really complicated one.
Hi, I'm Jillian Burke, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Are there any specific challenges or considerations for pediatric users of some of these devices or apps, and maybe you don't even know that they're pediatric patients when they're accessing them?
I mean, I can start. Yes,
Yeah, I
but
mean-
not because they're patient-generated health data. It's because there are special requirements for any medical product that's going to be used by pediatrics, and so you need to consider those and just add them onto any considerations for your patient-generated health data product.
Yeah, I was thinking of like if you're downloading or creating something that could be an app that somebody might interface with and put it out there to a broad population, like how do you have to anticipate in advance that somebody who's like 15 years old might access it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And is that just a nightmare logistically, or does it?
There's no more of a nightmare for this than there is for anything else. I'm sure many people in the audience can regale you with all the excitement of some pediatric products.
Thank you.
I think one other additional thing to add is just around the design. If you're thinking about wanting children, young people to use an app to record something, you need to design it differently from how you might for an adult. Like, show it to my kids and, oh God, Dad, you expect me to fill that in? So yeah, you just need to be mindful of that.
Hello, I'm Lily from Montreal McGill University. Thank you guys for your presentation. I had a question about the FDA moving fast and furious with all the regulations that must be met and adhered to with all the medical technology coming out in patients measuring themselves through electronic devices. But I'm wondering if there's a way that those could be overridden just by the patients accessing the apps and getting them, and it's as if they're consenting already to having their data out there, accessed by the creators who made the app, and also just there for anyone to, or not anyone to see, but for them to see and for it to be used in further studies and things. But okay, my main question was, instead of the companies, the individual app companies needing to double check or check that their methodologies all meet, you just showed a selection of all those rules, but there must be like a whole booklet. Who knows? Could it be overridden just simply by regulation lists that patients know of? Well, not patients, but people know of when they start using the app, and it could be simple like that. And why are they coming out so fast and furiously with it? It's as if, yes, it takes a long time for all those to be checked.
So they're coming out fast and furious because this is an area where there's a lot of rapid uptake and a lot of people who are really, really interested in it. Just having information that is provided on any consumer product does not change its legal status. And therefore, the status of that product as a consumer product or a medical device or drug or a biologic is not defined by how people feel about it. There's a framework for how all of that falls together. FDA has a really lovely flowchart to help people decide what they need to do and whether this is likely to be a device or not, whether this is likely to fall under specific HIPAA regulations or not, whether it is likely to need consultation from FDA on that dividing line. In addition, my favorite flowchart for all of this is from the MHRA. And so I think a lot of regulators these days have their pretty pictures around, do I have to come and talk to you?
Okay. But on the legal aspect, if it's the patient's property, their own information, just in your presentation, how they should, in a way, also be compensated for what they're allowing to be shared out there or allowing to be accessible, shouldn't they have the decision? In the end, they say it could be out there for studies or in the future production.
I get
So
what you're saying.
it could
I'm
be
also thinking,
overridden.
I'm also
Yeah.
just thinking, just because you want or don't want a hip implant doesn't mean that you get or don't get a hip implant. That hip implant, you have to go through the process of meeting all of the criteria in order to do that. And that hip implant, I couldn't just choose to get one that wasn't marketed in that jurisdiction. And so, that legal framework isn't going to change based on providing information.
No.
Well, thank you for the
so
question.
they-
In the interest of time, we're
just-
actually at time now. We could have a
okay.
follow-up discussion perhaps afterwards.
What
I'd
if
like
the
to thank the
patient
panelists.
and or not the patient, but the person and the people creating the app or
If it-
whatever?
if it's-
Perhaps we could chat more after?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for their really excellent presentations and